I usually make this list and put it on my Instagram story every year, but every time I do, there's always much more I want to say than can fit onto a small black screen, so this year I thought I'd do a video on it. 2023 was a pretty good year for metal music in my opinion. Periphery and Tesseract both dropped records in the same year, Spiritbox got a Grammy nomination for a legitimately good song, Sleep Token released a song about intense sexual...
Y'all are wrong. This song's about squirting.
We had a good year. I wanted to highlight the 10 releases of the year I had the most fun with, or that meant the most to me. My taste in heavy music ranges from cozy metal epic atmospherics and Pliny instrumentals, to Black Crown Initiate and Chelsea Grin's Hostage on repeat 16 times in a row. But there's a very fine line of stuff that I enjoy the most, and I think a lot of that is actually encapsulated in this list. So let's get down to it. Honorable mentions in no particular order go to Luminaria by Aviations, Take Me Back to Eden by Sleep Token, Soul Elegy by Termina, Descent by Orbit Culture, Human by Resolve, The Fear of Letting Go by Holofront, Suffer in Heaven by Chelsea Grin, A Sign of Things to Come by Silosis, Symptoms of Survival by Dying Wish, Death Below by August Burns Red, The Death We Seek by Currents, and Common Suffering by Harm's Way. All of those records I listened to this year, most of which have some bangers, but in whittling this list down to just the top 10, there were obviously going to be some that rose above the rest. Number 10, And Everything in Between by Unprocessed. I got into Unprocessed several years ago with Covenant, and to this day, that's still my favorite record they've ever released, and Everything in Between feels like it captures a lot of their vibes from 2018 and brings it forward into the band's current gent, avant-garde, tech thump thing, and still manages to ride a good line between brutal and catchy because Manuel's vocal parts are honestly super good throughout the whole thing. This guitar tone is also super unique. Like, they beat you to death with reminders that they can use their right hands really fast. Do with that sentence what you will. But this low gain 8-string tone is one of my favorite takes on extended range guitars that I've heard in a minute. Plus, that solo on Blackbone might be my solo of the year. That said, not everything on this record hits with me. The mixing on some of the vocals, some of the overly dense instrument passages that sometimes can get a little overwhelming. Whatever the hell that solo was on Thrash. But where they can find that balance between guitar porn and low-tuned groove is where I think they really have something special. Number 9, Ashen by Humanity's Last Breath. Ashen is the sound of you in a nightmare getting torn apart from the inside while getting dragged down to hell and shown horrors beyond belief. It's like an H.P. Lovecraft novel in audio form. It's terror incarnate for 45 minutes straight. The gunshot drums, the guitar's pitch shifted to drop Z, the endless bends, the tremolo picking, the chugs, the creepy hypnotic background leads, and a Philip vocal performance that sounds like someone hooked a microphone up to a kitchen sink. It's like Buster gave himself the challenge to keep seeing what he could produce that was more and more outlandish every time, and he made it work. I kept seeing his Instagram clips pop over a lot over the last year, and listening to this album made me go, yo, it's that riff! Over and over again. So this thing is brutal, no question, but listening to this whole album makes me feel exhausted. I think my appreciation for stuff like this comes in smaller doses and not just full-length beatdowns. I think everyone ought to listen to this record just to experience it if you like heavy music, but there's really no way it couldn't have ended up on this list. It just beats respect into you. Number 8, Mother by Veil of Maya. This is the first time I've been around for a Veil release since I first came across the band, so I was really excited to see where this album would go, but I have to admit, I'm a little tainted on this whole thing. My favorite Veil release doesn't come from Matriarch or False Idol or any of the older deathcore stuff. It comes from every single that released from 2019 to 2021, aka songs from the album that never was. Mother does retain a lot of that same sonic drive, but maybe doesn't capitalize on it in the same way that I was expecting. Nonetheless, there's still tons to love here. Lucas's cleans and screams are still incredible that both come from one person. The production is pristine. The synths really make me wish they played around with them more on this album. And there are still tons of Mark's polyrhythmic and disgusting moments that make me laugh and go, yep, that's Veil. I really like the fun, bouncy, futuristic energy this album has, and every band member is already so good at what they do, but I came away from Mother feeling like nothing really eclipsed those 4 between album tracks that set my initial impressions of them. Probably just a taste thing, but still a solid release overall. Number 7, Moments Elsewhere by Johnny Booth. It's a room that's in a country's bed. I'll keep the world Full disclosure, I had not heard of Johnny Booth prior to this record, but now having listened to Moments Elsewhere, you bet your ass I'm checking out everything else they've got. It's a really good combination of heavy and melodic. Fast, technical, sometimes incomprehensible heavy shit, like hardcore and noise rock came together so you can't tell what key the song starts out in, contrasted with moments of really well-crafted melodic relief that feel like your reward for outlasting that torrent of heavy that you just went through. And sometimes it's the other way around, with a song that's built on a melody that just gets destroyed by a wall of chaos at certain points, and it's honestly really well done. The variety on this is insane, and it's interspersed all around a record that transitions really well from one part to the next. As someone unfamiliar with Johnny Booth prior to this, I really appreciate this sort of ruthless aggression punctuated by quiet pockets of reflection. That's what most of this record is. And even now, still months after listening to it for the first time, I feel like I can glean even more from it. So it's at number 7 on this list for now, but there's every chance that maybe I bump it up higher as it just keeps growing on me. Number 6, War of Being by Tesseract. Similar to Veil, this was the first time I got to experience an album release cycle for Tesseract as a fan, and initially, I admit, the singles didn't really do it for me. Tesseract records can feel like such sprawling epics that listening to them in one sitting, front to back, almost feels mandatory. But not only did this record drop and make sense of this huge, emotional, sci-fi journey, but also had several tracks that I would gladly listen to outside of the context of this movie of an album. Echoes, The Grey, Legion, and Sacrifice are all bangers, and admittedly I was confused by the title track at first because it's 10 minutes long and meanders through like 3 different parts, but then I listened to it in the context of this record and I'm like, oh, I get it. I've always appreciated Tesseract's blend of heavy groove and atmospheric texturing. Like, I don't think there's another band that does it quite like they do. That said, not everything totally sticks the landing. To me, the mix gives way too much power to the drums. Dan's vocals are typically pretty good, but the lyricism itself can get really cheesy at times, and Tender was such a good song until the very end where the beat switches and the vocal flow switches with it for no discernible reason and just kind of ruins the mood. But in the grand scheme of this record, War of Being is the sort of prog odyssey that really only comes around once in a while, and I'm mostly really happy with what we got out of it. Number 5, Fatalism by Polaris. Barring some insane sonic genre shift, there was no way a new Polaris record wasn't going to be in Metalcore's Album of the Year conversation. For me, it only landed at number 5, not necessarily because there's anything to dislike about it, but because a couple other albums this year just happened to pass it by a little bit. These guys have always been great at forging riffs and creating catchy choruses, so it's not like it's a big sonic change for the band from where I sit. I think if anything, they probably tuned lower overall, but it's still a pretty similar formula for Polaris. This was probably the most traditional metalcore record I think I listened to all year. Most songs are verse, chorus, breakdown, chorus, and doesn't get super experimental with chord progressions and time signatures, which isn't a bad thing, so it definitely makes me see the potential of what this band could do if they weren't sticking to such a traditional, predictable formula, but this album is still great nonetheless. I wouldn't personally rank it above The Death of Me or The Mortal Coil, but I don't necessarily think Polaris need to outdo their previous works to still craft an album that ranks highly for me. And Ryan, wherever you're at now, your work and your art will never be forgotten. Thanks a lot for everything. Number 4, Heavener by Invent Animate. I first got into Invent Animate with Greyview, and it had me hooked from the moment I heard the first single. It was my favorite album of 2020. So because I liked Greyview so much, my curiosity wasn't whether Heavener would match it in quality, but whether it could firmly ground their sound and still produce something memorable. The ambience is there, the riffs still kick ass, and Marcus's vocals very clearly improved a ton over the last few years to give his screams more range and his cleans more fullness. Sonically, it's there. Memorability, not as much as Greyview. It's a bit difficult to pick some songs out from one another. They may be fantastic on their own, and most of them are, but together as a whole album package, they do tend to blend together a little bit. It's why I'm glad they released Heavener, the song, as a bonus track months after release. You can slap this at the end of the record, and you have a much better closer and a good cap on the whole experience. I'm just a little sad it came out not with the rest of the record, because now it means my vinyl feels incomplete. And honestly, it might sound like I'm dogging a lot on a record that I put at number 4, and I might be, but it's still really, really damn good in spite of its flaws. Number 3, Chronicles by Void of Vision. Yes, every song on this record was released either 1 or 2 years ago over the 3 Chronicles EPs, but all 3 of them were combined and their songs re-released back in February with the intended 12-track order, so I'm going to count it. Chronicles takes the band's existing chugcore style of riffage and adds more clean choruses, industrial production, and gloomy underground German nightclub vibes, and what came out was 36 minutes of nu metal electronic face breakers, and it's glorious. It's the record that finally sold me on Jack's screams, and pairing it with James's clean choruses on top of the pounding beat makes this a really good combo. The Hannah Greenwood feature on Alter is especially proof that you can make music this absurdly heavy and still put some soaring vocals over the top of it and it'll sound great. Whereas Ashen is produced with the intent of beating you to death while listening, Chronicles is trying to make you lose yourself in the beat of this seedy techno nightclub in Berlin that the band clearly drew a ton of inspiration from. And I, for one, was happy to get lost in it. Thanks for this one, boys. Keep doing that shit. It's a lot of fun. Number 2, Superbloom by Silent Planet. This is, without a doubt, the most cohesive front-to-back thematic metal album experience released this year. This is different from what most Silent Planet albums sound like, but it's got so much good stuff packed into its runtime that I really don't have any complaints with that. The band steps a little away from the progressive poetry core of their last few records into this doom eternal, high-gain cinematic soundscape that still retains a lot of their complex emotional articulation. It's less about the prog technicality and more about marrying Mitch's low E string to these alien synths and saw basses. I appreciated what Northlane was trying to do on Obsidian, but Superbloom takes this cyberpunk matrix core electronics and background ambiance and keeps it metalcore as opposed to turning it into dance music. And I think it really pays off. Garrett's lyrics also feel like they haven't skipped a beat. Even if he's not dropping annotated bibliographies on you for his references mid-song, the vibes he's setting are incredibly dense, and his vocal patterns and syncopations feel like they fit no matter how off a rails the song might get. He even dropped a metaxas in there. I had to Google that word. Overall, I feel like Superbloom front to back makes very good use of this stylistic change and doesn't compromise on the band's artistry. It's still Silent Planet, it's just weird in a different way. And it was almost good enough to be my album of the year, but one other album just took it over. Number 1, Periphery 5, Gent is Not a Genre. Full disclosure, Periphery is my favorite band. So when P5 dropped, I immediately put it at the top of my list because I was curious to see if anything else would top it in my head as the year went on. And now, looking back at everything else that dropped this year, I don't think anything else beats it for me. Mark keeps writing parts that make me question if it's a solo or a rhythm riff. Misha went to the car bomb school of whammy pedals. Spencer relaxed his pitch correction and still absolutely nailed his vocal takes. Jake just casually dropped some of my favorite solos of the year, and Matt makes those drum parts his bitch every single second. Nolly, though one of my favorite parts about Periphery records is the motifs they'll keep reusing as the album goes on. There was only one motif I noticed get used twice on this whole thing, but that's okay because they make up for it with callbacks to their older material on this one. Wildfire's chorus is just the event-pitched ABBA semitone with vocals, Zagreus brings back the Four Lights riff, and Thanks Nobuo underlines the final passage with You're Shining and It Shows? Are you fucking kidding me? Not just those, but the Impossible GGD riff made it onto this thing, and the Hades death music, and the Final Fantasy VII theme, but more than anything, this record came out at a point in my year where I was really unsure of a lot of monumental goings on in my life. I remember sitting down with this thing when it dropped at midnight, getting the full boat mature Periphery experience with a lot of fun moments, references to the past, and sheer variety of songwriting, and for that, and for so many more reasons, Gent is Not a Genre is my album of the year. Now I only have one question left. Where do we belong?
Get the schlong.
From Do We Belong. Brought to you by Do We Belong.